In recent years, we've seen a lot of talk regarding new projects that will be set in Middle-earth. Whether it be the Rings of Power and Amazon's Lord of the Rings MMO, or Peter Jackson's new projects, brand new media set in Middle-earth is nothing but inevitable. But with corporate greed and suits having in their hands something as spiritual and as foreign to the hyper-consumerism of today as the Lord of the Rings, certain questions must be answered. Is this truly Middle-earth? Would Tolkien have ever approved of it? And, considering his beliefs, at this point, is it even ethical to commercialize Middle-earth in the way that we are witnessing? The answer, as I will cover it, is divided in two parts. The first is j.r.r. Tolkien's beliefs in his own words, and the second is how those beliefs may be ignored to the Lord of the Rings' own detriment. To some, it may come as a shock, but Tolkien was passionately opposed to what we have come to view as Western consumerism and the industrial apparatus that gave birth to and maintained its existence. He saw the world as gradually losing its soul for the sake of material wealth, choosing the physical over the spiritual, and ultimately diverging from the true way us humans are supposed to live. Instead of being one with nature and with our communities, we have become one with ourselves, and grown isolated within ourselves despite the vastness of our ever-growing cities. This traditionalist way of looking at the world is highlighted repeatedly in his personal letters, and the professor was aware of the fact that this societal shift did not limit itself to just humans and their society, but also something he found fundamentally important: their stories. Myths, according to Tolkien, were one of the most profound ways that truth could be revealed. In the ever-growing chase for profit, myths and fairy tales had, step by step, been reduced to dumbed-down versions of themselves, for the sake of reaching an even wider audience of children that could consume these stories in more simplified forms. Although this was Tolkien's main gripe with the Walt Disney Company, I'm certain that, if you tried, you would definitely find parallels with what has become of Tolkien's own stories. For him, his writings were the myths he loved so deeply, and his opposition to the defilement of fantasy especially was vocal already from the early 20th century, as highlighted in his essay on fairy stories. Within an increasingly globalized world, Tolkien saw everything slowly become one, and it is something he disliked with intensity. What he saw as the unique cultures and languages and feelings of the nations of the world were all becoming Americanized. In letter 53, he explicitly says that, "I must also admit that in the photograph of our little cherub actually looked the biggest ruffian present. Well, I wonder, if we survive this war, if there will be any niche, even of sufferance, left for reactionary back numbers like me and you. The bigger things get, the smaller and duller and flatter the globe gets. It is going to be all one blasted little provincial suburb, when they have introduced American sanitation, moral pep, feminism, and mass production throughout the Near East, Middle East, Far East, USSR, etc., how happy we shall be." The United States were not merely exporting their cinema and their music, though Tolkien disliked this as well, they were also exporting an entirely different way of life, the same for everyone, everywhere. A life he deemed foreign to the natural state. He saw the modern world being gripped by greed and the ever-growing thirst for more and more profit, with the result being a corrupted state for all humanity, an effect similar to that of the One Ring. In fact, the Lord of the Rings at its center is partly all about greed and the spiritual strength required to overcome it for the salvation of your soul. Numenor and the stories of our fellowship are notable examples of this. In his view of the United States, he saw a people whose nation was founded on the pursuit of wealth to the detriment of the soul, and his view of Americans in general becomes clear once you delve deep into his letters. In letter 328, not a soil in which the fungus growth of cults is likely to arise. The horrors of the American scene I will pass over, though they have given me great distress and labor. They arise in an entirely different mental climate and soil, polluted and impoverished to a degree only paralleled by the lunatic destruction of the physical lands which Americans inhabit. He was deeply concerned, for example, about the Tolkien clubs that were sprouting up mainly in the United States, which had gradually become affiliated with the counterculture that was beginning to rise in 1960s America. "Yes, I have heard about the Tolkien Society," he said. "Real lunatics don't join them, I think. But still, such things fill me too with alarm and despondency." Now, why am I saying all of this even though almost 50% of my viewers are from the United States? This is because the rights and the usage of The Lord of the Rings in entertainment today is largely in the hands of American companies that target mostly American audiences, or audiences in the West whose interests and attitudes have become gradually similar to those in the United States, in the way that Tolkien feared. For Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings was a deeply spiritual work, directly inspired and influenced by his Christian faith. To have people then mainly coming from this society that, in his opinion, lacked the soul he deemed so important, obsess over his deeply spiritual work but using it to promote their anti-traditional beliefs was horrifying to him. This, I think, by itself is an important matter to consider, regardless of whether his beliefs about America and globalism were valid or not. The truth is that Tolkien was deeply involved in his political opinions. His views on religion, on family, on national identity and gender roles were, regardless of what anyone else tells you, in line with conservatism and traditional Catholicism. His works reflected this reality directly, as his writings were the myths that he created that revealed his own truths, whether consciously or subconsciously. You speak of a sanity and sanctity in The Lord of the Rings, which is a power in itself. I was deeply moved. Nothing of the kind had been said to me before, but by a strange chance, just as I was beginning this letter, I had one from a man who classified himself as an unbeliever, or at best, a man of belatedly and dimly dawning religious feeling. "But you," he said, "create a world in which some sort of faith seems to be everywhere without a visible source, like light from an invisible lamp." I can only answer, of his own sanity no man can securely judge. If sanctity inhabits his work, or as a pervading light illuminates it, then it does not come from him, but through him. And neither of you would perceive it in these terms unless it was with you also. Otherwise, you would see and feel nothing, or if some other spirit was present, you would be filled with contempt, nausea, hatred. What the end result of his writing efforts were was that The Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally Christian, European, and medieval-inspired, as well as traditionalist work, showcasing the never-ending battle between life and death and the constant struggle with sin and redemption. The Lord of the Rings, without these fundamental spiritual aspects, is nothing. It is simply a world with people and places and lore that is devoid of meaning, purpose, and most importantly, soul. It was this soul, I would argue, that made The Lord of the Rings the phenomenon that it grew to be. All of this was written by a man with a deep disdain for this modern, globalized, industrial and consumerism-obsessed society. Begs the question, yet again, of whether his works should be treated with the respect that this man himself would have demanded. This leads me to the second part of the equation. While following the death of j.r.r. Tolkien, the Tolkien estate was largely active in the protection of his written works and legacy, the rights to the movie and game merchandise of The Lord of the Rings was not owned by them. These were owned by Middle-earth Enterprises, formerly known as Tolkien Enterprises, who purchased the exclusive rights from the United Artists Corporation in 1976 for $3 million. The UAC themselves had bought them from Tolkien directly in 1969 for £100,000. The vast majority of the content about Middle-earth that you see, whether it be games, movies or shows, are largely connected to this branch of the ownership and is not necessarily connected to Tolkien's successors, although with notable exceptions. Therefore, even though we know for a fact that Tolkien would have likely hated what is being done commercially to his world, is it really a problem when it was he himself that knowingly sold these rights? Well, the answer at first glance is no, since the rights were sold and no longer his per se, especially following his death. While that answer is simple, however, the reality is not. Regarding Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, J.r.r. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, said, "Tolkien has become a monster, devoured by his own popularity and absorbed into the absurdity of our time. The chasm between the beauty and seriousness of the work and what it has become has overwhelmed me. The commercialization has reduced the aesthetic and philosophical impact of the creation to nothing. There's only one solution for me: to turn my head away." They eviscerated the book by making it an action movie for young people aged 15 to 25. Christopher, who was vital to the process in which the book was written in the first place as a member of the Inklings, was concerned with the films focusing too much on the Hollywood action and not on the spiritual and philosophical reality of Tolkien's writings, not to mention changes and inaccuracies that had been made to the source material. To see why Tolkien Sr. may have agreed with his son, we need to look no further than Letter 210, in which the professor goes into great detail in describing his disagreements with a potential script for a Lord of the Rings movie back in the 1950s. I will read small portions of the letter to give you an understanding, though know that he had a lot more to say. Z has intruded a fairy castle with a great many eagles, not to mention incantations, blue lights, and some irrelevant magic. He has cut the parts of the story upon which its characteristic and peculiar tone principally depends, showing a preference for fights, and he has made no serious attempts to represent the heart of the tale adequately, the journey of the ring-bearers. The last and most important part of this has, and it is not too strong a word, simply been murdered. Further in the letter, he comments strongly when even wrong words are used in the dialogues and descriptions, or when the calendar and passage of time is inaccurate. Z is altogether too fond of the words hypnosis and hypnotic. Neither genuine hypnosis nor scientific fictitious variants occur in my tale. Saruman's voice was not hypnotic, but persuasive. In other parts he states, "A splendid sight. It is the home of Galadriel, an elven queen. She is not in fact one. Delicate spires and tiny minarets of elven color are cleverly woven into a beautifully designed castle. I think this deplorable in itself, and in places impertinent. Will Z please pay my text some respect, at least in descriptions that are obviously central to the general tone and style of the book? I will in no circumstances accept this treatment of Lorien, even if Z personally prefers tiny fairies and the gimcrack of conventional modern fairy tales." And to finish it off, this is what J.r.r. Tolkien says about the sounds that Balrogs were going to make in this hypothetical movie. "The Balrog never speaks or makes any vocal sound at all. Above all, he does not laugh or sneer. Z may think he knows more about Balrogs than I do, but he cannot expect me to agree with him." In another part, he even complains about the death of Saruman being depicted in a wrong and inaccurate way, which for fans of the extended editions of the trilogy, this may sound some alarms. As you can see, throughout the entire letter, Tolkien goes over every little thing, the most minute details, and explains why they are categorically wrong, as well as why it is so important that the script gets them right. Whether Tolkien is in the right or wrong when it comes to film adaptations is not the point. The point is that he would have likely hated the Peter Jackson trilogy. And in my opinion, if he would have hated the absolute masterpiece that is the Peter Jackson trilogy, it may be an objective fact that Tolkien would have been passionately opposed to what is being done to his world today, a world he spent an entire lifetime on. What is being done today, as you can see in the Rings of Power for example, at least in my opinion, is they have removed the substance of the world. A substance founded on principles the showrunners obviously disagree with, and have merely retained the intellectual property that is the Lord of the Rings. Similar sentiments, perhaps to a lesser extent, may be felt about the gold rush to make as many video games as possible in the last few years and in the future, as well as the recent announcement of new movies. While I'm excited to watch Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis' return to Middle-earth, it is a bit concerning that an entire movie is being planned for such a minor part of the source material. It brings into question whether the project is being pursued with the proper respect, or if the intellectual property is simply used for recognition, and that is the only extent of J.r.r. Tolkien's actual part in it. Either way, in my opinion, and regardless of everything so far, Tolkien did sell the rights to his works for financial gain, thus they ceased being his property. I would nonetheless argue, however, that if proper respect is not given to Tolkien's original intentions and philosophical understanding, The Lord of the Rings will turn into this soulless and generic thing that a lot of fans have started to see, especially following the new trailer for Season 2 of Rings of Power. This to me is especially sad when considering that the existence of global giants such as Amazon and Warner Brothers and their effect on society and treatment of fairy tales is precisely what J.r.r. Tolkien himself fought against his entire life. Naturally, no adaptation is perfect, and the fact that he would have likely been opposed to the movie trilogy indicates that his standards for adaptation were probably impossible. Nevertheless, it is with the pursuit of the impossible that excellence is reached, and I guess I doubt that what we have seen in recent years has excellence in mind. J.r.r. Tolkien himself summarizes this perfectly in letter 328. Of course, The Lord of the Rings does not belong to me. It has been brought forth and must now go its appointed way in the world. Though naturally, I take a deep interest in its fortunes, as a parent would of a child. I am comforted to know that it has good friends to defend it against the malice of its enemies. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.